Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for inviting me here today. It's actually not about technology. It's about people, and it's about people using technology. I agree with the first speaker today. Technology is a leveler, and it will equalize societies if they're clever enough to use it properly. So in my view, the whole area of the microbiome is nothing new about it. It's just we gained advantage because we were onto the technology earlier and probably cleverer than some other people. And it's been a privilege over the last 12 years to be involved with Teagasc and UCC in what we call the APC Microbiome Institute, with shared minds in this area. Now, I can't come to the Aviva Stadium without mentioning this, and that is that there's nothing that is more important than the microbiome, which you're going to hear today. It is all about the microbiome, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise, even the welfare of our rugby team. And for this piece of work where we looked at their diet and their microbiome, we won the Overselling the Microbiome Award. And if you don't know what that is, there's a self-appointed journalist who actually thinks that some of us are overstating this, and we were given the dubious award of this Overselling the Microbiome because we dared to say that there are other elements of a modern lifestyle in addition to diet, but including exercise, that might have an influence on your microbiome. Believe it or not, even a cold climate influences your microbiome, and there are cold adapted microbiota that actually can influence the composition of fat in human tissue. So we dared to show that the Irish rugby team actually had an advantage over controls based on their exercise and their diet. And we're in good company in that Overselling the Microbiome Award because most of the leaders in the microbiome science received that award. But we will go on to show that blogger that we were right. Now, Barack Obama, some time ago, actually it was a decade after the completion of the Human Genome Sequencing Project, made this statement. And this has been somewhat controversial, but whether you agree with the specifics of the ratio of the economic benefit, what I can tell you is that the human genome is rather small, somewhat puny, and contains insufficient information for full development. Same is true of mammalian microbiome that is so important to Teagasc. Insufficient information for full development. We require information from elsewhere. We require information. We get additional DNA from the microbiome that colonizes the body. All of the sensory systems require information from the outside environment. The microbiome, the immune system, the nervous system requires information, and we get that from the microbes that colonize us at birth. You can't do much about the thing on the left, but you can do an awful lot about the thing on the right. And diet drives microbial function, and diet drives microbial composition. Diet is the main driver. So from the point of view of economic welfare, the microbiome is a therapeutic target. It's manipulable, not just by drugs, but also by diet and food. It's a therapeutic resource. It can be mined for novel bioactive food ingredients, and we are doing all of this. And it's also a source of biomarkers, not just to predict early disease, but to do something really special, and that is to predict risk of disease. And that is actually happening, and we're in all of these spaces. So diet drives the microbiota, but it isn't just that. Because of interactive cascades amongst microbial signals, inflammatory signals, immune signals, and metabolic signals, diet is actually driving all of these. So it's no surprise that we're seeing this escalation of chronic disease in modern society, which actually involves chronic immune and allergic disorders, but coincidentally the same risk factors are increasing the risk of obesity and metabolic disease. They're occurring together. We now feel that the microbiota, particularly in early stage of life, is actually providing the risk factor for those diseases. Any disruption or disturbance of the microbiota in early life is a risk factor for that, because the microbiome is developing, is being acquired at the time when the immune system is becoming primed, and when metabolic cascades are becoming primed. Disruptions I'm referring to are antibiotic use or poor diet. So the microbiome is relevant to overnutrition, but also actually to undernutrition as well. It's a net provider of nutrients to the mammalian body. Now, just to drive home the point, and I'm conscious of pressure of time, there have been several high-profile papers that are completely relevant to Teagasc and its mission that have appeared in recent times, and I'll give you a whistle-stop tour of them because they are quite striking in their importance if you're not aware of them. The first one came actually from Teagasc, NUCC, in the form of APC, some years ago, published in Nature, and we've continued this. But in essence, what this showed, it showed something that is a game changer. A game changer. Why? Because it showed that in the elderly, when they go into long-stay institutions, or when they come under the care of the medical profession, they tend to collapse their dietary consumption. They collapse it to something that's quite monotonous, usually a milk-based diet. That is followed by a collapse in the diversity of their microbiota, which in turn is relevant and correlated with inflammation or inflammaging. Objective measures also of things like frailty and poor survival. Now, we did just correlations in this, but we've a fair idea that the direction is causal because this happened first when we followed them, then this, and then we saw that. So the sequences suggest it's driving that way. And the editor of the Guardian newspaper published an editorial and said it more eloquently than I could ever say it. Because he said that the people in Cork have shown that diversity is not just the spice of life, it's staple. And the reason I said it's a game changer is because no longer is it acceptable for dietitians or food scientists to talk about controlling adequate amounts of nutrients and adequate amounts of calories and think that's okay. That isn't okay because they don't control for diversity. It's essential that you have food diversity to get maximal microbial diversity. When you eat, you're not just feeding yourself, you're feeding your microbes, and your microbes are relevant to other factors in your health. And if you think the elderly is a concept, some sort of abstract concept, this is the elderly. And if you don't know who this is, well, you haven't lived. Now, microbiome science is explaining other things that we just took for granted, or maybe that we preach to people. It's no longer acceptable to just tell people about food pyramids, to tell people about breastfeeding being important, breast is best, to just pronounce all these things. Because humans don't take that on board. That's like religion or preaching or something like that. You've got to give them some mechanistic explanation. This great Irishman actually was the one who said, and it was a privilege to ever hear him lecture incidentally, if you pass small stools, you have to have large hospitals. And he related the rise of chronic disease in Western world to the fact that we have small little constipated stools and the paucity of chronic disease, non-communicable chronic disease in the developing world to the fact that they pass large stools and largely related to fiber. And I went through a long period in the United States seeing people write articles about Irishmen writing about hot air and no data. And the truth of the matter is we now can explain Burkitt's theories, more than theories. We now explain Burkitt's observations not just on the basis of some vague notion of what fiber does to the human system, but actually what it's doing to the microbiota, which in turn is relevant to human welfare and human health. And it's that biomarker that we should be measuring and how we can now show he was actually right all along. More than that, one can now use the microbiome to actually predict who needs more fiber and who doesn't need more fiber. And this is just one study published in Cell and Metabolism recently showing in humans and mice that it really relates to the ratio of certain microbes in the feces will actually tell you who can benefit from more fiber in terms of improvement of metabolic welfare. And you can read those papers yourself. More than that, the microbiome is actually far more likely to give you personalized medicine than the genome ever was. The genome is actually quite weak in terms of nutrigenomics or personalized therapeutics. The microbiome has far greater potential to do it than the human genome. And this is a beautiful study published in Cell out of Israel, not long, just towards the end of last year, showing that when you take a big pile of metadata and all the questionnaires about what people are doing and their lifestyle factors and their blood tests, etc., microbiome information could replace much of that without any loss of accuracy and predict who'd respond in terms of blood sugar change to various meals, all the way down to actually being a new personalized predictor of disease risk. If you can do that for metabolic disease, you can quite possibly do it for other chronic diseases that are related to the microbiome, including immune and allergic disorders. More than that, I said that when you eat, you're feeding your microbiome. You're not just doing that, you're probably feeding the next generation. Because this paper in Nature in January showed, it followed up from our study in the elderly some years ago. This study showed that if you collapse the dietary diversity in animals, this was a study in experimental animals, if you collapse the dietary diversity, yes, they confirmed you do collapse the microbial diversity, but it gets worse as you go down the generations. So another game changer probably should be that we should no longer just bring in women for antenatal classes and tell them about how to relax and various things for these antenatal classes that have been a tradition. We need to look at their health and we need to look at their diet because they are eating for the next generation. And maternal diet is every bit as important as just addressing breastfeeding after the birth of the baby. More than that, your microbiome is relevant. It's a critical component in terms of how diet can influence cardiovascular disease. This is just one slide summarizing the work of Stanley Hazen, who's shown that the microbiome provides the critical metabolic component to the metabolism of things in red meat, namely phospholipids and also carnitine, that generates compounds which, when absorbed, are pre-atherogenic. The significance of this, of course, is we can actually analyze the microbiome now and probably guide people on who needs to reduce their consumption of red meat and phospholipids based on analysis of the microbes in our gut that are capable of producing this. This is also druggable, but much easier to manipulate it by diet. And lastly, things we add to the food. This is of relevance to Teagasc. This is of relevance to all of us. Artificial sweeteners, now this is somewhat controversial, but do influence the metabolism of the microbiome, and this has been indicated, suggestive evidence in good publications, that this is actually a risk factor for diabetes, the very thing people might be taking it to prevent. Emulsifiers. Again, somewhat controversial, needs to be confirmed, but emulsifiers influence the barrier function in the gut, increasing ingress of various organisms, changing the metabolism of the organisms, and suggestive evidence in experimental animals that this might be a risk for metabolic disease and indeed chronic inflammation. I've even seen data on pesticides and fertilizers suggesting that, why wouldn't they? That they not only influence the microbiome in the soil, etc., they can influence the microbiome in your gut, and they might actually be doing some good and some harm. Needs to be studied. So the lesson, Jerry Boyle said to me, just one message. This is the message. Mind your microbes because they will mind you. And that's just a list of some of the things I said. Now, why does Teagasc need to invest in this? Because you're already good at it. Because you've been doing it for a long time. And this is an independent assessment of what you've been doing. And Teagasc, in the form of APC with UCC, is ranked in the top 5 in the world in the area of microbiome science. And if you look at some of the subfields, it's number 1. Number 1. Now, when you go to implement that very fine document, that very fine Foresight exercise, remember this, you're investing in people. Don't think too long about it. You don't need to do much more talking for the implementation, Chairman. Invest in people, or else we'll lose that position. Thank you for your attention.